My name is Robert Franklin. I am conducting an oral history interview with Roger McClellan on September 2nd, 2016. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. I will be talking with Roger about his experiences working at the Hanford site. So, Roger, the best place to begin is the beginning. So, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born in Tracy, Minnesota, out in the prairies of southwestern Minnesota. Tracy, a little town of 3,000 people, and my father was a blue-collar worker. My mother came from an agricultural family, and they were, part of a generation in some ways contributed to, but also their lives were substantially influenced by World War II. They in some ways were saved economically. So my father went away in 1942, and I would faithfully write every Sunday evening to him at an APO address in New York and wonder where he was. And in summer of 43, he came home and said, well, I was up in Canada building an air base on Hudson Bay, Churchill, and up with the polar bears and the Eskimos. And got another job as Hanford Engineering Works, Pasco, Washington. So 2 weeks, I'm going to catch the train and be off. And maybe if I can find a place to live, your mom will come out and join me.
So, I'm sorry, and what year were you born?
1937, January 5, 1937.
And do you remember when your father left for HEW?
Well, he, as I said, he spent 42 and 43 in Canada working on an air base. That construction company ended up being engaged at Hanford, so he came out in 43 in the summer and lived at Hanford, the construction town. My mother soon joined him when they found a small trailer they could live in. She worked in the commissary at Hanford. And then in the summer of 1944, they came back to Minnesota. My brother and I had lived with our grandparents on a farm for a year, and my sister with an aunt. And so we got on the train and headed out to the state of Washington on a new adventure in the summer of 1944.
Wow.
And then that fall, we lived for the summer in Sunnyside, Washington. Remember well, a 8-plex apartment, if you will. Pretty exciting. You go to the end of our street, take a right, go a half mile, and there was an honest-to-God Indian teepee with an Indian that lived in it. That was pretty exciting for young kids.
I bet. Was that one of the Navy home? Was that one of the Navy homes?
No, that was it was a part of the Hanford complex that they had built some housing and outlying areas while they were constructing new homes in Richland. So near the end of August, my father came home one day and said, "Hey, they finished a new group of houses in Richland, and we're going to be moving down." Next week or two. Neighbors will drive us down. I'm going to come in off of graveyard shift, and I'll be at our new home, and you can meet me there.
And what kind of home was it?
Well, we said, well, where is it? And he said, well, it's a 3-bedroom prefabricated house, a so-called prefab, and it's on 1809 McClellan Street. And my kid brother and I jumped up down and said, gee, on our own street. So we later learned that many of the streets were named for individuals from the Corps of Engineers. So McClellan was in the Corps of Engineers, and one block long street up in the southwest side of Richland.
I live a stone's throw away from. I live on Stanton.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
2-bedroom prefab. So.
Yeah. So we did just as he said. The neighbors drove us down, and we got to the new house. The door was open. We went in, and there was my dad flaked out in the bed. He'd come home from graveyard shift and welcomed us to our new home.
Are you related to General? Is there any family relation to?
Well,
McClellan?
only speculation. Probably one of my more noteworthy traits is procrastination. And as you may recall, General McClellan had some problems with procrastination.
Yeah,
Uh,
as a U.S. historian, I'm very well versed in
yeah,
especially the first 3 years of the Civil War. Yes, he certainly was.
and he also liked libation, and I think we shared a similar taste there.
And bluster and
But he was short of stature. I'm tall of
it's true.
stature. But
Yeah, he looked
no,
much better on a horse.
I don't know. I've done a little bit of digging, and I found a cluster of McClellans near Kirkcudbright in Scotland.
Sure.
We actually have a castle. McClellan is more of a large manor house than a castle, but interesting.
What did your father do at the Hanford site?
Well, my father initially worked in construction, and then very quickly, as they started to assemble the operational workforce, he went to work as a patrolman. Part of the what today we call security force, and of course worked for DuPont, and then he moved quickly from there into what was called the separations department or operation. That was the unit that we learned later was involved in separating out the product, plutonium, from the irradiated fuel elements containing uranium. So he spent most of his career actually in working in the Purex facility.
Oh, okay.
Earlier, he had some time in the bismuth phosphate separation plant, and then in the Radox, and then Purex was ultimately the big workhorse separations facility for the Hanford operations.
And how long did your father work at Hanford for?
Well, for his total life, then I think he passed away at age 62, and my mother, very soon after we came to Richland, went to work in the food services facility at Marcus Whitman Elementary School, which is where we were going to school. And so I do remember in the third grade seeing my mom in the cafeteria as we went through and picked up our lunches. And she was a very ambitious lady, very intelligent. She got her shorthand and typing in order in quick order, and then went to work and became the secretary of the principal of Columbia High School. She always commented she was pleased that one of the students in the class, I think, of 1948, a noteworthy graduate was Gene Conley. The trivia question is who's one of the athletes that played for two different sports teams in terms of major sports, and that's Gene Conley, a Cole High graduate, played for the Boston Red Sox and for the Boston Celtics, and earlier was a student at Washington State University.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, so my mother spent basically her career as a professional administrator, and
Did she work at Hanford at all?
no, she really always kind of focused on wanting her family,
Right.
and she really didn't want that extra travel time, and so she worked for a period of time the United Way or Community Chest, and then back into the school system, and was the administrative assistant or secretary to a number of principals in different schools in the Richland school system.
So tell me about growing up in Richland, in a government town, and the prefab, and how.
Well, I think growing up in, obviously growing up is a unique experience
Right.
for everyone. But we had come from a small town, Minnesota. Everybody knew everybody else. Everybody was from there.
Right.
Many of them had 2, 3, 4 generations living in the area. coming to Richland was totally different environment. Everyone was from somewhere else. And there were, a number of people from Utah, a number of people from Colorado, Denver. Turns out all of those were connections back to DuPont and DuPont's operation of facilities in those areas. And there were quite a number from the Midwest and a few from Montana, areas where there was, not a lot of industrial activity and people could be recruited, like my father, in terms of, with married, 3 children, why he was lower down on the draft order, and so that was prototypical of many of the people. My classmates would, they'd be families of 2, 3, 4, 5 kids, and their fathers, some cases were blue-collar workers, some cases they were, engineers, kind of new kinds of professionals that I'd never had experience with, even as a little kid. And later when I'd spend summers with my grandparents on the farm in Minnesota, the professionals we came in contact with were, our family doctor, the farm veterinarian, the lawyer, the banker. And so Richland, one of the interesting aspects was the extent to, as a young kid, I had fellow students whose fathers were engineers or chemists. In fact, one of my classmates, class of 1954 from Columbia High School, was his father was W.E. Johnson.
Oh,
he was
okay.
the top guy running Hanford for many years for the General Electric Company.
Yep.
The other thing that's unique is no one owned their own home.
Right.
You rented your home, and DuPont left soon after the war ended. DuPont had been brought in because they were really a unique company. Not only were they large, but they, because of the nature of their business, producing explosives, they were in the business of designing, building, and operating facilities. That was a unique set of activities. So, as I say, you're working with building, manufacturing explosives. You wanna know your facility. And
right. Well, I imagine too. There's a culture of safety in DuPont with dealing with such.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Deal with when your product is
Yeah.
explosive
Yeah. And many years later, I would actually have interactions professionally in terms of DuPont, and that safety culture was present and continues today. But that was also present at Hanford. And then that ability, as I say, to make modifications in the design as new information came available.
And do that in-house too.
Yeah, that was all done in-house. And then, we euphemistically said it changed from DuPont to General Electric. General Electric was the prime contractor, and sometimes we refer to them as Generous Electric. Of course, they operated on a pass-through basis, so it was the federal dollars. That's the other thing I think unique in terms of Richland school systems. There was no private property, so there was no private tax base. So the dollars for the Richland schools flowed through that same line of dollars that came from Washington in terms of authorization, appropriations, and were ultimately administered by the Richland Operations Office of the Atomic Energy Commission. So if you're in the Richland Operations Office and you're involved in overseeing the expenditure of dollars, your kids are going to the Richland schools, you're certainly not going to slice some dollars off the budget for School District 400, Richland. Your kids are going to be impacted.
Right.
So the schools were, quite frankly, extraordinary quality. I don't think I fully appreciated that at the time, but
I don't think any of us do at the time.
yeah. So as I told someone even recently, I'm still working off the vapor left in the fuel tank that they started to fill, and when I went to Marcus Whitman, to Carmichael, and Cole High, and then headed off to Washington State University.
Oh. What else can you say about growing up in Richland that might be different from a lot of other people's experiences in a normal?
Well, I think at that time, at Richland, there was an element of, kind of the long hand of Washington and planning communities. There was an interesting intersection of class, if you will, more based on, are you an hourly worker or are you a monthly payroll? So-called non-exempt and exempt payroll. And there was a recognition that there was an element of status associated with education. So, but overlaying that at the intersection was the fact that when we moved from 1809 McClellan Street to 1122 Perkins, we lived in a B house. Now that's one of the things that's a little different. I mean, the houses had alpha numbers on them: A houses, B houses, 1, 2, 3 bedroom prefabs. So a B house was a duplex, 2 bedrooms on each end. But on Perkins Street, we could look across the street, and there were 2 L houses. Those were 2-story and 4 bedrooms upstairs. Living room, dining room, kitchen downstairs. They were pretty spiffy.
Yeah.
So here you have this strange junction of somebody who was an hourly worker was not at first bat going to be assigned an L house to live in.
Right.
You were a manager.
Right.
The manager that lived across the street ultimately would become the chief engineer for the Hanford project. That was Orrin H. Pelkey, Pilkey, senior. And he was an engineer, grew up in Texas, trained as an engineer at Texas A&M, and then gone off, worked for Chicago Bridge and Iron Works. Had a lot of experience. So I remember well there, I'm a kind of a tall, even those days, skinny kid, and I was playing out in the front yard, and I saw this black Ford sedan drive into the L house that had recently become vacant, and out hopped 4 people. And, they weren't too unusual, except they were short of stature. The 2 adults were about 5'4", and the kids were, under 5 foot. We soon became good friends, and ultimately, Orrin Pelkey was one of my scoutmasters and a mentor.
Oh.
He encouraged me in terms of mathematics, engineering, physical sciences, and a love and appreciation for the outdoors.
Oh.
But I did many, Sunday afternoon kind of engineering or learning experiences in his study at his home. I remember doing one of those, and it was a calculation of pressure in a large tank, and what the pressure would be involved in lifting the lid on the large tank. Only many years later did I learn that was the double-wall steel tanks at Hanford that he was overseeing developing. And, on that particular occasion, I actually could best his son, who was my classmate in high school, Walter Pelkey. Walter would go on to become a very distinguished engineer, a professor of engineering science at the University of Virginia. his older brother, who was my good friend also, Orrin Pelkey Jr., went on in a very distinguished career in marine geology, was the Washington Duke professor of geology at Duke University. So I think that kind of segues back in terms of the educational environment. I think there was a lot of inspiration, if you will. As a young kid, you could see people who were successful, and you soon recognized success was tied to education.
Right, I suppose it's knowing so many people from so many different places. I guess I could imagine maybe that people in Richmond were aware of a wider world than, say, someone in a small town in Minnesota or Arkansas might be.
Well, I think that's true, and I think they each brought their own culture. I mean, I recall our next door neighbors in Sunnyside. They were from Oklahoma, and even as a 7-year-old, I kind of knew a bit about the Dust Bowl and whatever, and the Okies, and I was admonished by my parents. We're not supposed to call them Okies. That's a little bit of a derogatory term. But when I still remember the experience, we going with my mother, and she, of course, had her troop of 3 kids. I was 7, my brother was 5.5, and my sister was 4. And we're going downtown Sunnyside to mail some packages and shopping. The lady next door had her troop of 3 kids, about the same age, and except she had a newborn baby. So we went into the Sunnyside post office and mailed the packages and came out, and the baby started to squall. And so the lady sat down the steps of the post office in Sunnyside and opened her blouse and started to nurse her baby. Well, it's not quite what you would expect in Tracy, Minnesota. Little bit different culture. So you had different cultures. Again, my friends, the Pelkeys, their mother had gone to Hunter College in New York, very well-educated lady, and we would very frequently take trips to the public library on Sunday afternoon to pick up a new collection of books. And if you went to her home, why, there'd be a book on almost every table. She was an avid reader. And that encouraged us to do the same.
That's very interesting. Sorry, I go ahead.
Well, so I think that difference in everybody being from somewhere else was something that kind of pulled things apart in terms of a community. On the other hand, the fact that everybody was in some way involved with Hanford brought people together. And overlaying that in those days, the late 40s, was the element of secrecy. You didn't really know what was going on. Things were compartmentalized. Many years later, I was taking a graduate course at what was then the WSU, the Joint Graduate Center, really, in a sense, a predecessor of WSU. Yeah. And so I had the individual teaching that was Dr. Lyle Swindeman, who was an environmental scientist at the Hanford Laboratories. And we were going through each of the different AEC facilities around the country, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Shippingport, whatever, as to what they did, how they managed environmental activities. It was really rather remarkable in terms of the early 1960s when I took that. Well, one of them we focused on, was Hanford. And so that particular evening, we had a flow chart for the Purex facility. So I came home and I was doing some homework at the table. My father came home from a swing shift and sat down with a cup of coffee, and we're chatting, and he's looking at what I'm doing, and he said, "What the hell are you doing? Those are classified." I said, "No, look up there. It's unclassified." "No, I think that's classified. That's what we're doing all the time." So there was this little bit of a conflict there. He was not absolutely convinced that I had the unclassified version of the flow documents for the Purex facility.
Well, that makes sense too, right? Because he would have come during Hanford during World War II when secrecy was paramount. I mean, if you said anything about your job, you could easily be on the next train out.
Oh, absolutely. And the other is elements. I recently had a conversation with some people in terms of plutonium workers at Hanford, which my father was one of those. And ironically, many years later, I would be studying plutonium. I was involved in the first meeting that gave rise to the U.S. Transuranium and Uranium Registry. My father was enrolled in that, and I continue today to have an interest in plutonium toxicity and what we do to protect workers, which, in my opinion, was remarkable in terms of at Hanford. Part of that is you have a bioassay program. And, what's bioassay? One of the elements of bioassay program is you collect samples of urine periodically. You analyze them for the radioactivity, and then using very sophisticated models, go back and project, estimate what exposures an individual may have in terms of internal deposition. Well, it was classified as to what people did, but now I can understand if I just gone down the street and taken a look at which addresses had a gray box on the front doorstep, which was the urine samples that were being collected, I could have identified who were the prospective plutonium workers at Hanford. I don't know if the Soviets had anybody doing those street checks in Richland or not, but they could have identified who were the plutonium workers pretty readily.
Interesting. I just wanted to come back to something and say that it's remarkable to hear you talk about the impact of the mixed income neighborhood you lived in, and that you identified that, we lived in this mixed income neighborhood from B, with the B house next to an L, because that was, as you might know, that was Alvin Pearson, the man who designed the Richland Village. That was his idea. That was one of the things he pushed through, was having mixed income neighborhoods so that you didn't have a total segregation of people by class. And it's interesting to hear your views on that and how that affected you.
No, there was that element of a kind of a utopian planned community approach. I don't want to go too far on it. There's a book out there. It's got a corruption of the word plutonium in it, written by an individual who puts herself forward as an academic historian. I'm not certain where she got her degree, what her credentials, but I can tell you the book is filled with hogwash, as my grandfather would say. Absolute unvarnished hogwash. I don't know where she got a lot of her information. It's misinformation, as she tries to contrast and compare Richland, the Hanford site, with Mayak and in the Soviet Union. And I've studied both of those. I know both of them quite well, and I also know the outcomes in terms of health of workers at both those sites. She's totally off base, and I always like to call that to people's attention. They said, "Have you read the book in its entirety?" I said, "I've read pieces of it, but I really don't want to waste my money buying it."
See, so you graduated in '54, correct, from Columbia High,
right?
And then you went to WSC,
right?
And so what did you go to study at?
Well, we have to back up a ways.
Okay.
In terms, there's an interesting event that occurred, and I'm going to be a little bit vague in this because I may not remember the specific dates, but 1948, using the Royal We, the U.S. Detected airborne radioactivity.
Right.
and the west coast of the USA. That was not surprising. We knew that the Soviets were building a copycat facility to Hanford. And when we detected radioactivity in the air, specifically radioiodine, iodine-131, that was a very good, not just clue, but we knew they were processing radioactive fuel.
I've heard that their first facility was almost an exact copy of the one in the 300 area, except instead of being horizontal, it was vertical. Do you know anything?
I'm not really knowledgeable of the absolute details of theirs, but again, the key element is that what they were doing is they were taking refined uranium fuel,
Right.
creating a reaction in terms of neutrons and producing plutonium-239.
Right. We knew they were doing the same thing that we were doing.
Exactly. And when we detected radioiodine in the air, we knew they were processing that fuel. Now the key is how much plutonium were they producing? That's what we really wanted to know. And somebody said, well, gee, they're doing just what we did at Hanford. They're processing green fuel. Well, what do we mean by green fuel? Green fuel is freshly irradiated uranium oxide fuel with plutonium in it, and we're now, rather than letting that cool down for a period of time so the short-lived radionuclides decay off, we're processing it almost immediately because we want the plutonium. That's what happened in terms of Hanford when the first processing, I think late in 1944, early 1945, to produce plutonium to go to Los Alamos. So somebody said, well, gee, if we know there's X radioiodine in the air, what we want to know is Y amount of plutonium. Well, why don't we just repeat that a big experiment? So that was Operation Green Run. That was the code name for what would ultimately be the largest, to my knowledge, release of radioactivity from the Hanford operations, a planned experiment that went astray. They took the freshly irradiated green fuel, chopped it, added the nitric acid. And I have reason to go back through the dates. My father was probably involved in that crew. And then the radioiodine started to come out the stack, but Mother Nature didn't cooperate. We had a major meteorological inversion and basically fumigated, quote, the Inland Empire with short-lived iodine-131. It has a 8-day half-life. That would create great controversy over whether there were ill effects related to that. As it turned out, in terms of those releases, that was highly classified. But it led to a real push in further work at Hanford on radioiodine. And they started a major study. That study involved feeding radioactive iodine to sheep each day. And along the way, they decided, gee, we always have this possibility of exposures on the site. Why don't we maintain an off-site flock of control sheep? That sounds like a good idea. Who could do that? Well, gee, why don't we have the Richland schools do that? I can't go through all the details, but I'm reasonably certain there are discussions at rather high levels, and rather surprisingly, the Richland School District started a vocational agriculture program. I was one of the early students in that program. The school farm was located right across the road from where the WSU Tri-Cities campus is located today.
Oh, right.
We had a large tract of land, and in fact, if you were enterprising as I was, you could sublease a piece of that land, and I actually had the sublease on the 10 acres right at the corner of Jadman, across from the WSU campus, where I grew corn and alfalfa for 4 years that I was in high school. And I also had several orchards and a vineyard for 2 years. But that school farm maintained the off-site control sheep for the big Hanford radioiodine and thyroid cancer study that was being conducted. What was particularly important out of that is one of the people that WSU recruited was Leo K. Bustad. And Leo K. Bustad was a veterinarian. He had been a distinguished military veteran, had spent a significant portion of his military time, World War II, in German prisoner of war camp, which substantially influenced. But he came back to WSU and pursued a master's degree in nutrition and a doctor of veterinary medicine degree. When he received the DVM and the nutrition degree, he was an ideal candidate to recruit to Hanford for involvement in the studies on radiation effects. I first then met Leo Bustad when he was a Hanford scientist and periodically would stop by the school farm and check on the status of those off-site control sheep. So he encouraged me in terms of veterinary medicine. My friend Orrin Pelkey across the street encouraged me in engineering. When I headed off to WSU, or WSC, 1954, I actually enrolled as an engineering student. I took engineering, I took economics, I took pre-veterinary medicine, and then I decided to go down the pathway of veterinary medicine. And that led me then to seek summer employment. So I was employed as a student at Hanford in 3 years, 57, 58, 59. And then Leo twisted my arm to come back as a full-time scientist in 1960 when I received my Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree.
We should note that Bustad is also one of the most well-known or prestigious WSU alumni in terms of his contributions to veterinary medicine, and they have there's an entire hall named after.
Oh yeah,
him on campus.
Well, Leo is a wonderful, remarkable individual. I can relate many stories with regard to Leo, but one of those I had just finished what was probably my first major scientific manuscript on the metabolism of strontium-90. And strontium-90 is an alkaline earth element, behaves very much like calcium, and so it's readily absorbed in the GI tract, goes to the skeleton, and strontium-90 is a beta emitter, radiates then the bone and the bone marrow, and so you're concerned for those effects. So we were studying strontium-90 in miniature pigs. And so I had finished this manuscript on metabolism of strontium-90 and gave it to Leo to review. And Leo said, I'll read it over tonight, come back tomorrow, and we can talk about it. So I came in and next day, and he said, well, this is really good, but there's got a little bit of a problem with a few aspects. I said, oh, what's that? And he said, well, rather surprised there's only one author. And I knew, oh boy, I'd goofed. I said, oh, well, this was just a draft, Leo. He said, well, I hope so. I thought I had quite a bit to do with the design of that experiment. And he said, well, I said, what else? He said, well, it's got some statistics in here. I know you and I aren't statisticians. Maybe we ought to have some somebody else review this. I said, who do you have in mind? And he said, Carl. Well, turns out he was sort of the top statistician at Hanford. I said, we don't want to waste his time with that. And he said, oh, I've already called him up. He's expecting you in at his office in 300 area at 4 o'clock. And he said, we'll have to have it wrapped up by 7 because I'm going to be home for dinner at 7:30. Sure enough, I went in and we spent 3 hours, a wonderful experience. Very junior scientist, and here's one of the leading statisticians in the world, in fact. And so I said, and what else? He said, well, we need some good editorial advice. And I said, well, what are you thinking about? He said, well, how about Phil Abelson? I said, Phil Abelson, the editor of Science magazine? Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah. I said, well, we're going to need some connections there, Leo. And he says, we got him. He's a cougar. Mm-hmm. He picked up the phone and called Phil Abelson. And Phil introduced me to Phil on the phone, and that was the beginning of a lifetime association that I had with Phil Abelson.
Who also has a building named after him.
Yeah, and many years later, I was the president and CEO of an organization called the Chemical Industry Institute of Toxicology from 1988 to 1999, and Phil Abelson was on my board of directors. And so Phil and I were lifelong friends. I was very pleased many years later when I was recognized as the Regents Distinguished Alumnus, Washington State University, I knew that Phil was also an alumnus, but I didn't appreciate he was the first Regents alumnus in terms of Washington State University. And then as I went down the list further, Leo Bustad was on that list. And so I'm very proud in terms of that lineage.
That's great. As a side note, your name was so familiar to me in the beginning because I did a project for them for University Communications for a historical timeline and had to find pictures of all of the Regents distinct. What year were you a Regent?
Golly, I think 2007 maybe.
Yeah, I think I found your picture somewhere and
yeah.
put it up on the website.
Yeah, yeah.
So wow, so that was so you got all three degrees at Washington State?
No, I only received one. It's always interesting, particularly if I'm up here in the courtroom, because they say, where did you get your bachelor's degree? And I say, I don't have one. And they plaintiff lawyers spend a lot of time on that. I went to WSU at a time period when you could actually gain admission with the appropriate number of credit hours after 2 years. So I ended up going to Washington State University and completing my only degree, a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, in 6 years, and graduated in 1960.
Wow.
And so I was 23 years old. I later, kind of on a lark, took a Master's in Management Science, an MBA in an executive program at the University of New Mexico, and I received that degree in 1980. That was a lot of fun because, again, it was multidisciplinary. There were engineers, there were chemists, physicists, social scientists, physicians, lawyers, and I've always enjoyed that kind of interdisciplinary environment, and so I head that in terms of that program at the Robert O. Anderson School of Management at University of New Mexico. And then later I had the good fortune that the Ohio State University recognized my career in comparative medicine, veterinary medicine, and awarded me an honorary Doctor of Science degree, which I'm very proud to have received.
Awesome. So you mentioned that you worked 3 summers as a Hanford and at the Hanford site, and then were brought on at Boosted's urgings back to Hanford. So how long did you stay at? So you graduated in 1960 and then came back to.
Yeah. Well, then I actually planned to stay 2 years until my fiance Kathleen Dunnigan, graduated Washington State, and then we'd have kind of free range. And one of my understandings with Busted when I came to Hanford is he would make certain I could visit all the schools around the USA that I was interested in potentially going to pursue a graduate degree. He said, I won't get you to Perth, Australia, the other one you're considering, but I'll get you to those 5 in the U.S. And he did pursue, live up to his bargain. Leo is a great mentor in terms of encouraging me to, do lots of different things and always kind of push yourself to the limit. He signed me up, I think, at the second year I was at Hanford. I was 24 years old, and he asked me to keep a day open. And as I recall, it was in March '62, and I said, "Well, Leo, what we need to fill in the calendar. What do you have in mind?" He said, "Well, I've signed you up to give a seminar in the Department of Medicine at the University of Washington on bone marrow transplantation and miniature pigs." Well, that was pretty heady, and but he was reassuring as I was getting my slides together. He said, "Roger, remember, when you talk to that group of people, you're going to know more about the subject than anybody in that room." So that's great advice, to a young student, young scientist, to have confidence that if you're well prepared, you can go before a pretty formidable audience because you should know more about that topic than anybody in that room.
Right. How was it coming back to Hanford after it had been privatized? I'm sure you probably.
Well, yeah, actually, it was when I was at WSC, my parents bought their home, and so I saw those activities. And then when I was employed, I was in the Hanford laboratories, and that was a remarkable organization. The individual that headed that was H.M. Parker, Herbert M. Parker. And the biology division within that was headed up by Harry A. Kornberg. And Leo Busted reported to Kornberg. I reported to Busted. I was on a very short reporting line, if you will. Mr. Parker reported to W.E. Johnson. So I knew Herb Parker personally. I'd had the opportunity to give one of what were sometimes called the Parker seminars. Individuals would be invited to give a seminar for Mr. Parker and a very small group of people in at the Parker's office and library in 300 area. Those were always, with some trepidation. You couldn't turn down that invitation because people maneuvered to get them. But that was a pretty august audience to have the head of the laboratories, H.M. Parker, listening to your presentation and then having questions.
It sounds like a very encouraging workplace.
Oh, it was.
Of research and discipline and hard work. And
hard work was rewarded. I remember in 1962, I had a call from Mr. Parker's office to come in, and a little bit uncertain. Leo Busted had kind of gone out on a limb in terms of encouraged me to go to an international meeting in England, the International Congress of Radiation Research. And I initially took in my travel schedule, and Leo took a look and said, "Gee, this doesn't look very good, Roger." And I said, "What do you mean? I'm going to the meeting for a week. I'm going to take a week's vacation. I'm going to just be a month or so after I'm married." He said, "Oh, no, there's no problem with that. I'd like for you to spend a lot more time there. There's a lot of people I want you to see and meet." So he said, I'll draw up a revised schedule. So I came back the next day, and he had a schedule as 4 weeks. I thought, holy cow. I said, "Leo, this isn't going to fly. I mean, it certainly won't get by Mr. Parker." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you don't know the saying. There's a saying around the lab and the working troops that if you can be gone 2 weeks, you can probably be gone forever." I said, "I don't want to tempt fate." He said, "Oh, Herb's bark is always a lot sharper than his bite." He said, "I think he'll approve this. He thinks you're one of our rising stars." So sure enough, Herb Parker approved it. And then just the week before I'm going to this meeting, I get a call from Mr. Parker's office. And I thought, oh, he's going to personally tell me he's changed his mind. And so I went into his office and seated in the outer room, and the door to the throne room, if you will, opens, and Mr. Parker was a rather large individual, came out and with this kind of a limp handshake, "Hello, Roger, great to have you here. Come on in." And then "You're probably wondering why I've invited you to my office today." And I said, "Well, I am." And he said, "Well, we have a program here. I like to recognize people for their contributions, and it's a rather private matter." And he gave me a little black leather case, and it had a nice little commemorative statement in there. And then he reached into his coat pocket and he pulled out an envelope and he said, "And there is a monetary award that goes with this. I'm sure that's going to be useful on that very prolonged trip you have planned to Europe." So Herb could have he was an outstanding scientist, also had a very wry British humor, and he certainly encouraged me to become involved in activities in radiation protection. I'm very confident I would never have become a member of the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements if it had not been for the encouragement that Herb Parker and Leo Bustad gave me.
Could you speak a little, just so for people that might not know, can you speak a little more about Herb Parker and his work at Hanford, and since you knew him personally, is Herb Parker's work at Hanford and his importance to history at Hanford?
Well, Herb Parker was trained as a radiological physicist in England. Very bright individual, and did some seminal work in radiological physics, particularly related to treatment of cancer in what we call depth dose curves. He developed these to estimate the radiation dose that would be delivered to a tumor, if you will, from an external X-ray beam. And one of the people that he learned of and came in contact with was Dr. Cantrell at Swedish Cancer Institute in Seattle. So he joined Cantrell to continue his work. And then World War II came along, and Herb got pulled into the Manhattan Project. And he was a part of a group of individuals trained primarily in physics, some in chemistry, and brought together initially at Oak Ridge. And they were to be sort of the liaison between the operations, the medical community, and assuring the safety of workers. And that got coded, if you will, as health physics. That was done in part because no one wanted to use the term radiological in terms of this particular activity because of the secrecy during World War II. Later, Herb would express profound dislike for that term health physics, and I agree with him. I would think it probably was a useful placeholder for a time period. So Herb was one of that early group, and he was assigned to Hanford. I think, if memory serves me, he came to Hanford in August of 1944. And I said I came in September to start the third grade in 1944. And Herb had a key role in the overall design and management, ultimately, of the program in terms of radiological protection of the Hanford workers, and you could go more broadly, protection in terms of chemical agents, and not protection just of workers, but the total environmental program. In my opinion, the program that Herb Parker really provided the leadership for was one of the foremost programs in terms of environmental and worker protection that was ever put in place in a prospective way. And as part evidence of that, Mr. Parker, and it was Mr. Parker, he did not have a earned doctoral degree, set about writing with Cantrell kind of a handbook, if you will, on radiation protection. What is it? What is radiation? What does it do to the body? And he wanted to see that distributed to the appropriate workers at the earliest possible date. It ran into some difficulties in terms of clearance, but it ultimately was released on January 5th, 1945, my 8th birthday. So it's easy for me to recall. That document is an extraordinarily exposition on what we knew about radiation then, and many of the basic concepts that were outlined by Cantrell and Parker in that document are still applicable today.
So he's really a major leader in health physics.
Yeah, and I would say Herb would probably agree. He would prefer radiological protection.
Radiological protection.
Yeah, and I see it as part of that big picture of protection of workers and the environment from agents, whether the agents that were working, processing, in terms of the whole chain of radioactive materials, uranium to plutonium, fission products, or whether we're talking about chemicals. And my career, in fact, has been punctuated. I've been involved in radiation throughout my career, but I've also spent a very large portion of it dealing with chemical agents.
And how long did you work at Hanford Labs?
Well, as I said, I came back as a permanent scientist in 1960, and I was very fortunate, I think, working under the leadership of Leo Bustad and Harry Kornberg and Mr. Parker, to be advanced very early to the rank of senior scientist. I soon put the graduate program sort of on the side and pushed ahead. In 1964, Leo came to me and said, they're pushing on me again to come back to Washington, D.C. on a special assignment. I'm not really enthusiastic about it because my kids in school, but I think I'm going to suggest they take a look at you. What do you think about that? I said, well, gee, that sounds like an interesting opportunity. So first thing you know, I'm on my way to Washington, D.C., and a series of interviews, and we reached agreement that in October 1 of 1964, I'll go to Washington, D.C. Well, then all of a sudden, things started to change in the summer, basically, of '64. Decision is General Electric is going to leave. The total operation will be fragmented. Sometimes I refer to that as the disparaging phrase of maintaining employment in the face of absence of a product, because it was pretty clear we had enough plutonium-239. We didn't need Hanford any longer to produce anymore. And General Electric ran a very efficient operation. So General Electric is headed out, and they start to look at firms to run different pieces of the operation, and it became known that the laboratories would be managed as a separate enterprise. And very quickly we learned that was going to be Battelle Memorial Institute from Columbus. For those of us at Hanford, it didn't take much time in the library to kind of determine that, gee, this seems to be upside down. We ought to be taking over Battelle, not Battelle taking us over. But that's the way it was. And so I was interviewed by Sherwood Fawcett, who had been announced as the first director of what would become the Pacific Northwest Laboratories. And the outcome was predictable. He said, we want you to join the Battelle team. We seem to have this problem. You're leaving before we arrive. So I said, well, that's just the way it is. And he said, well, maybe we could delay your departure. I said, well, perhaps we could talk to the people in the AEC and see if they'd be agreeable. And Mr. Fawcett, or Dr. Fawcett, said, well, what would they have to do with it? And I still remember telling him, they have something to do with everything that goes on here. Mm-hmm. They certainly will have a say. Well, they were quickly agreed. So it was agreed that I would become a Battelle employee. So as I recall, January 4th or thereabouts, 1965, I walked out the door on Friday evening and threw my GE badge in the box and came in on Monday morning and picked up a Battelle badge. And that Friday, I headed off on leave of absence to join the Division of Biology and Medicine of the Atomic Energy Commission in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
So the next phase is after not quite 2 years in Washington. I was then strongly encouraged to go to Albuquerque, New Mexico to run a research program on inhaled radioactivity that was operated by the Lovelace Foundation for Medical Education and Research, a part of a triad of a medical research institute, a private medical clinic, and a hospital. And in that role, running that program, I essentially competed with Hanford in terms of a very significant research program that Bill Baer pioneered in leading at Hanford. So while I was gone from Hanford, I in a sense remained connected, certainly scientifically and as a competitor, but a very friendly competition.
And did you ever come back to work at Hanford after you went to New Mexico?
Well, I never came. Well, I came for a couple of weeks in the summer of '66 and sort of bid my farewell, wrapped up a few things, and I continued to publish some papers interrelated. I came back many times in terms of the Hanford Symposium that became a regular feature. And then I had the opportunity more recently to serve on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the U.S. Transuranium and Uranium Registry, which ironically I was involved in some of the early activities initiating it. in 1966, and now we're 50 years later, celebrating the 50th anniversary of a landmark program started by a group of occupational physicians, Dag Norwood, one of those small contractors in the privatizing activity at Hanford. Then that later went over to Washington State University, and today is maintained and operated as a piece of the Washington State University College of Pharmacy.
Yep. Oh, when you were at Hanford Labs, what kinds of work were you? You mentioned work on pigs, bone marrow. What other kinds of work were you doing?
Well, we had a major study that Leo was wrapping up on the effects of radioiodine in thyroid cancer in sheep. I did some ancillary studies related to how we translated those results to people, to humans. And one of the key pieces of work that I did, and it was really fit into a bigger picture of many people involved, but we looked at the effects of exirradiation of the thyroid gland and compared that to the protracted beta radiation of thyroid from ingested or inhaled radioiodine. And that showed that the protracted radiation exposure was much less effective in causing damage to the thyroid. So that was a very important piece of work. Another major study, the primary one I had responsibility for, was one that involved miniature pigs given strontium-90, and that they received their strontium-90 dose each day. We had 3 generations of pigs, not because it was a study of genetic effects, but that's the way in which we could introduce additional animals into the study. It ultimately involved over 1,000 miniature pigs, essentially studied for their total lifespan. And the endpoints were the development of bone marrow dyscrasias, bone marrow cancers, leukemia, and development of bone cancers. So that study continued after I left, and I think in total it represented a very important contribution. And a key finding, again, was the importance of dose rate delivery. When radiation dose is protracted over time, it's much less effective in causing damage and in causing cancer. Another key study that was done during that time period linked back to Operation Green Run. And we essentially simulated a part of that in a study in which we fed radioiodine, iodine-131, to dairy cows. We followed the thyroid and radioactivity in the dairy cows. We collected samples of the milk. We milked them. And then we had a group of volunteers that drank that radioiodine contaminated milk, aliquots of it, and we monitored their thyroids. So you could put together this total picture of a contamination event in terms of iodine-131, what's happening in terms of the cow's thyroids accumulating iodine, what's happening in terms of the iodine-131 in the milk, and then what is happening in terms of concentration of radioiodine in the human thyroid for the people ingesting that. That was a very valuable set of data to help us understand what happened in terms of Operation Green Run, and it was an extraordinarily valuable piece of information we could use in terms of assessing what was happening post-Chernobyl and post-Fukushima.
What did that data show as to
contamination
in humans?
Well, it's basically a key message out of that is if radioiodine is released in the event of a reactor accident, you really want to focus on what you can do to control it. And you can control multiple ways. One way is you simply take the cows off of any pasturage. You put them on the stored feed that doesn't have radioiodine in it, and you make very certain that you simply stop the milk in that supply line. In the case of Chernobyl, I was able to go to the Ukraine the fall after the Chernobyl accident and do some work there, reconstructing what was going on.
Oh, wow.
And we could see, and I think has subsequently been borne out, in many areas the Soviets were very effective in limiting the exposure of populations. And part of that was cut off that contaminated milk supply. The other that came out of that was something we had a clue to, and that is that the stable iodine intake is very important. If an individual is in what we call a goitrogenic diet, a diet low on stable iodine, then they're going to take up much more of the radioiodine and get a higher radiation dose, as well as I think there's a synergistic interaction between the goitrogenic thyroid that's low in terms of iodine intake, and it's pushing to do its best, if you will, limited iodine. So that combination of living in an area that's goitrogenic and being subjected to radioiodine is bad news.
How would someone naturally have a low iodine intake?
Well, very difficult in the USA or in most advanced countries, because one of the things we do is we introduce iodine into flour.
And what about
Salt?
Salt also the same?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, okay.
So
But in certain areas, in the Ukraine and in Belarus, at the time of the Chernobyl accident, things were not working well politically. Areas that had subsidized practices in terms of iodized salt, iodized flour, that was gone. They were reverting back to the old ways of flour being produced from wheat grown in these low iodine areas. And so
their bodies would have been naturally much more tuned to be grabbing that iodine and storing it.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and so the people most at risk were those individuals in those goitrogenic areas. And in fact, that pattern was well studied in terms of people knowledgeable of thyroid and thyroid disease.
So did you know this about the iodine? You knew this about the iodine then before Chernobyl happened and were able to identify it, or this came as a result of Chernobyl?
Well, what happened is Chernobyl confirmed kind of our fears, if you will.
Okay.
An individual by the name of Lester Van Middlesworth at the University of Tennessee in Memphis was a major figure in studying thyroid diseases. And Leo Bustad, Van Middlesworth were very good friends. I later became good friends with Van Middlesworth. And he understood this, alerted him to this, and in fact, our study that I referred to of radioiodine in cow's milk, we actually studied the influence in a small supplemental study of changing the iodine intake of the cows. So we knew, we understood that picture then, but it was after Chernobyl that I think Lester Van Middlesworth was a key figure in pointing out these were the areas that were going to be at risk in the Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus.
Wow. The cows that were used for the study, were those cows were those someone's cows, or were they cows at the Hanford labs?
Oh no, we purchased the cows.
Cows,
We purchased
okay.
the cows in the open market. It was kind of fun. We actually we had a much bigger experiment planned early on. We were actually going to have the pastures and contaminate them and so on. But that was a multi-million-dollar experiment that got shrunk down to something you could finally do. Kind of an interesting sidelight is, as I told you, I came to Hanford as a summer student. I was fortunate. I fit into a program that was designed primarily for engineers. There were 100 individuals in the program in '57. I think there were 98 bona fide engineers. There was a graduate student from Wyoming and me, a veterinary medical student, on it. But and Leo had an enthusiasm for bringing in students. So when I came back and was a permanent staff member, we regularly recruited students in. So I can recall when we were planning the cow study, Leo and I had a set of resumes and applications in front of us, and Leo pulled out one and he said, I think this guy is really our guy. And his name was Eugene Ellefson. And I said, I spotted him, Leo, and I knew you'd probably pick him out. He said, why is that? I said, because he's from Stanwood, Washington. That's where you grew up. He's another Scandinavian. And he said, oh, Roger, I said, I knew you'd see through that, but remember, this guy grew up on a dairy farm. We need somebody to milk those cows this summer. So we had Gene Ellefson, who later went on to a very successful career in veterinary medicine, was one of the students working with us that summer.
Wow. How did you get the volunteers to ingest the milk? Did they know of the?
Oh, they knew that they were ingesting. In fact, they were all, as best I recall, the individuals were all professionals within the radiation protection unit at Hanford.
Okay.
Today, whether we would have allowed them to be subjects of their own experiment, I don't know. But I want to assure you that the radiation doses they received were extraordinarily small.
Okay. I was just curious.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh no, it was.
You hear human subjects. You're like,
Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, we went through a time period when there was a lot of attention given in terms of work done under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission and using radiation, radionuclides in human subjects. And during that time period, this study was one which, the people by then, Battelle was operating the laboratories, but they had to go back and pull out all the records. And I can recall very well the day I received a call from an attorney with the General Electric Company and said, I've read your papers in which you're a co-author reporting these studies with 5 volunteers at Hanford. What can you tell me about them? Well, it turned out our scientific papers published in the open peer-reviewed literature were one of the best pieces of information, and one which one could use to readily calculate the radiation exposure of the individuals and show that it was what I would call de minimis.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. When did you finally retire, or have you retired?
Well, I'm not really retired. I've transitioned. I think my career is one of Hanford and studies on ingested radionuclides. And a very important part of Hanford that I think should be emphasized is that we were involved in what I would call issue-resolving science. We were trying to develop science so that we could resolve issues, solve problems create information that could protect workers, protect the environment. I'm concerned that over the years, science has changed in many quarters. Now sometimes I accuse some of my fellow scientists of being engaged in issue perpetuating science. Can we keep this going till my career is over or my graduate students' careers are over? And sometimes even a bit of, will this arouse enough concern on the part of the public that they'll fund what I want to do? When the era that I was involved at Hanford, I'd say it was issue resolving science. The problem, the issue, it wasn't a random walk through the scientific thicket trying to find something interesting.
Why do you think that's changed?
Well, I think we always have tension, and sometimes the tension, we can simplify it by talking about basic versus applied science. I think that's an artificial distinction on it. Some of the most basic fundamental findings in science have been serendipitous findings that came out of applied science. I really am not an enthusiast of the view that the best and the brightest can go into the laboratory and just sit down and we'll have some great thoughts about what comes next. Some of this, I think, comes out of the high energy physics community, where there is a bit of that. But I'm a strong believer particularly in the use of public funds, that public funds should be used for science in which we do have issues and we want to obtain information that's going to help us resolve those and use the science for the benefit of society. I think we sometimes get a little, quite frankly, maybe a little pompous as scientists, that we know what the issues are, whatever, and the public would just listen to us more and give us more money while we'll solve all the problems. That's not really the way the world works. I think that science is a very vital part of the whole society, but it has to be a part of it, and it has to be interlocked and working with the other elements of society. I also think that many times we find scientists getting so wrapped up in their particular discipline that they fail to appreciate that most of these issues are so complex. They're not solved by one scientist, one discipline. They're really solved by a team of people. That becomes very challenging because systems in terms of reward are not always designed to reward teams of people. We focus on rewarding individuals. And I would say, I think at Hanford, in the time period that I had extensive involvement, there was a teamwork orientation and a balance of recognizing the value of the individual, but the value of the individual contributing as a part of a team to solve a problem.
Do you feel maybe that the Cold War had an impact in how science was conducted, or that kind of teamwork or purpose-driven science happened, especially in the period you're talking about in the height of tensions in the Cold War versus this kind of post-Cold War world?
Well, no, there was I think a purpose. I mean, in terms of talking nationalistic,
Right.
I mean, we were in a war. The Battlefront War was over, but now we're in a new war, the Cold War. And we knew what the Soviets were doing. They knew what we were doing. And there was a battle. on. I think the other part of that influences this is if you go back to the tremendous contributions of science in terms of World War II to that winning that war. And certainly in many different ways, but we could go into the whole issue of radar, things that were done in communication, things that were done in aeronautics in terms of physiological suit design. I mean, development of antibiotics, all of that, the whole field of nuclear energy.
Mm-hmm.
My personal view is that nuclear energy has both benefited from those origins, but it's also had a heavy burden to bear. I did relate to the fact that I'm visiting here in Richland, and I'm going to go to a football game, and that football game, my grandson's going to be playing in one team from Western Washington, and they're going to be playing the Richland High School Bombers, and their symbol is a mushroom cloud.
Proud of the cloud.
Yeah, unfortunately, many people, when you talk about nuclear power and its role in meeting our societal energy needs, their first image is that mushroom cloud. Their second image is envisioning thousands of deaths in terms of people who were killed in the two atomic bombings in Japan. What they fail to appreciate is that, in fact, radiation is not a very effective in terms of producing cancer. It is really a weak carcinogen. That extent, it has a bad rap. It doesn't get as much of a good rap, probably as it should, in terms of its value in diagnostic purposes, in terms of human medicine, nor diagnostic purposes, treatment purposes in terms of cancer. Radiation is still one of our most effective tools in terms of cancer treatment. But all of that is sort of overwhelmed in the public view. And so I continue to be a very strong supporter, enthusiast, wearing my hat as a citizen, I think with special knowledge of radiation, as to what we should be doing in terms of trying to meet our energy needs. I think nuclear power has a key role. We've amply demonstrated that we can handle it and control it. We have had serious accidents, Chernobyl, Fukushima, but I think we can also learn from those.
Right. So we, I hate to.
I think we've gone well to over.
We've gone for a bit, but I hate to cut you off, but we do have another interview here in just a little bit. But before you go, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you would like to get on?
Oh. Well, there's probably about another hour and a half.
We'd be happy. I'd be happy to schedule a follow-up interview with you. There are still several questions that
I think there's a whole area that we ought to go into because I think, I mean, I know it sounds pompous, but I think I know it probably better than anybody else. This would take us down the line of radio accidents, inhalation of radioactivity, workers and worker exposure, and really the basis for much of the work that Bill Baer and his colleagues did at Hanford, and then the work we did at Albuquerque, initially with fission product radionuclides and then with plutonium. And then work done at the University of Utah with injections of plutonium, strontium-90 in radium in the beagle dogs. And then the study at UC Davis that involved ingested strontium-90 and injected radium in dogs, and that links back to the studies with miniature pigs. Here, those studies collectively provide a major portion of our knowledge of internally deposited radionuclides. The part that's fascinating out of that is when we look at our human experience in terms of the USA, I think we can be extraordinarily pleased with the fact that we did have effective radiation protection programs. Go back to Herb Parker. And so if there were, effects, injuries, they're extraordinarily rare, very localized. On a collective basis, I think we have ample evidence we did a good job. On the other hand, I can tell you that we have evidence post-Cold War that MIAC, the Soviet, was a very different situation. And in fact, we did the studies in dogs because we didn't have human experience, and we never expected to get it. What it turned out is the Soviets at MIAC got the experience that we never thought we would see, and we never wanted to see. Their human subjects, accidentally exposed, demonstrated that our dogs were great models, i.e., workers at MIAC were exposed at levels that did produce an excess of lung cancer, an excess of liver cancer, an excess of bone cancer. The lung cancers and liver cancers were really remarkably predicted from the dog data.
Wow.
Once you took into account two factors. One major factor, the dogs were clean living. They didn't smoke and they didn't drink. Smoking does cause lung cancer.
Yeah, it does.
And some plutonium exposure adds to that. Drinking in huge quantities can cause liver damage and liver cancer. Exposure of plutonium increases it further.
Well, that was great. No, and I would love to. We'd love to.
So we'll figure out sometime when we can continue into these others, and after you've looked at what you've got here and how much of it's usable.
Oh, there's a lot of it. Thank you so much. That was great. And I had a great time.